The meeting will please come to order. This is a Village Board Committee of the Whole meeting. For the record, I will note that all of the trustees are present, and on the dais is Mr. Frenzer and Mr. Brayman. Linda Malloy, John Praisner are here as well from the staff, as well as visitors and our consultants. Before we get rolling with the agenda, I was asked staff to give us a quick update, just the status of the ongoing conversations with the Wilmette Park District. Some folks thought that would be a good way to start, so I'll turn it over to Mr. Brayman for that. Or, usually in Committee of the Whole, we're a little more casual, so I'll turn it over to Mike to give us an update.
Thank you. Yes, we are making good progress with the Park District, and we remain on schedule to start construction, as we would hope, in late 2019 for sewer installation in the right-of-way, and then the first reservoir community playfields in summer of 2020. Park District has completed their 6 public meetings and public hearings on the topic. They've received helpful feedback from residents, particularly in terms of saving as many trees as we can at community playfields and at Thornwood Park. Based on that feedback, our engineers have drafted alternative reservoir locations at each park. Each actual alternative is less costly than the initial proposals. The reasons for that have to do with the depth and the type of gravity versus pump systems we'll be using. So that, I think, is positive from our standpoint on the financials. Park District had a very productive meeting on Monday where they reviewed all those alternative locations. They had a lot of discussion. They heard feedback from residents, and they anticipate being able to make decisions on what their preferred location is at each park at their next meeting in July. And we'll be working with their staff over the next week or so to answer whatever questions their board members and staff have prior to that meeting. So that is a positive development. We hope then by the end of summer we can have some type of agreement that's not the full-blown IGA, but some type of memorandum of understanding between the parties of where they want those tanks to be, so that we can begin with our engineering design and keep on our schedule. So things are looking good, and we continue to work closely with the Park District.
Okay, any questions for Mike? Okay, so we'll move on. Thank you for that update. We'll move on to item 2 on the agenda, which is presentation from Raftelis regarding the Stormwater Project Funding Feasibility Study. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. My name is Thomas Beckley. I'm the project manager for this project with Raftelis. With me, I have Keith Redling. He's an executive vice president with Raftelis, and he leads our stormwater group. He's actually my boss, even though I'm speaking first. So we're going to present the findings of our study for feasibility analysis related to the stormwater project that Mike just told you about.
And Tom, if I can jump in real quick.
Of course.
As a reminder, this is a feasibility study, so this is concept level. All the figures and estimates and data you see are very high-level concepts. And if we move forward with the utility fee, they're going to change. So the maps will change, the final dollar amounts will change, maybe even the tiers and the bands will change. So this is just to provide the board with a concept of what a utility could and should look like if we were to proceed.
Okay, for some reason, I have an agenda here, but it wants to skip that slide for some reason. It must be hidden or something. So we're going to talk about, give me your, sorry. I don't have it memorized, I must confess. So first we're going to talk about the stormwater funding alternatives. And then the crux of a lot of what we were doing in this feasibility analysis is looking at how we would pay for this project. Do we want to do a stormwater utility, a stormwater fee, or do we want to do it through the sewer fee? And we'll talk a lot more about that here in a minute. And then if we decide to go the stormwater route, talk about the stormwater policies that would be associated with that. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about implementation options and schedule, how long that would take. So just to give you some background, I'm sure you're all intimately familiar with this. We're talking about a $68 million project to pay for these storage improvements. And currently, the stormwater activities have been paid for by the village through the sewer rates in the past. So there are certainly activities that the village undertakes now. There's some capital improvements that have been built in the past, but not on the scale we're talking about for this project. And so in the past and currently, these are paid for through the sewer rates. But considering the size of this, $68 million, so when you consider a 30-year bond at about 4% interest, 0.5% for issuance costs, we're looking about $4.1 million total in debt service per year for 30 years is how much we would be paying for these improvements. And so that's why we've undertaken this feasibility project to look at how we might fund that. Do we want to do it through the sewer rates, or do we want to consider another methodology? So currently, these are basically the two methodologies that were looked at for this project. Continuing the current policy of using the sewer rate. The advantage of that is that it can be allocated to existing sewer accounts just like we're currently doing. And it's how improvements for stormwater have historically been funded in the village of Wilmette. Now, disadvantages. Water consumption's not really a great measure of stormwater demand. In fact, it's pretty poor, and that's how we would be doing it. So what does how much water somebody uses have in relation to their stormwater demand? It's not a very good measure of that. And probably the biggest challenge is consumption is weather dependent. So if we have a cool, wet summer, water consumption will go down and our revenues will go down, and all of a sudden we may not generate the revenue we need to pay for the debt service on the bond, the $4.1 million we talked about.
So something cool and wet like the May we just had?
Yes, our consumption would be down, most likely. I haven't talked to Melinda to confirm that.
She was nodding her head, so
yes,
consumption's down in May.
Yeah, and that's the challenge we face everywhere. So, and that's a challenge that we always have with utility rates. But, when it relates to stormwater, even more so, especially with this one where it's so heavily dependent, a vast majority of the revenue requirement for the stormwater utility will be debt service. Whereas when you have other utilities, usually you have much more O&M or other kind of capital projects, like you could delay say, well, we won't buy the Vector truck that we were going to buy for the sewer utility this year, we'll wait till next year because we're having a bad year, and things like that. There's more flexibility in the budget, whereas with this revenue requirement, a vast majority of the revenue requirement is going to be debt service. So a stormwater fee is the other option we looked at. It's based on impervious area, and what that means is that's basically hard surface on a lot. Parking lots, roofs, any other hard surface that water can't get through. And in general, this is a common approach used throughout the country to measure impact on stormwater utilities. The bigger the impervious area, the more runoff a property is going to have, and the more they're going to rely on the stormwater infrastructure to prevent flooding. So the advantage of this is it's a dedicated, steady source of program revenue, because once you determine impervious area, well, we'll talk a little bit about policies. There may be opportunities for credits for certain properties or something like that. Our revenue will be pretty stable. There won't be large changes in impervious area from month to month, year to year even, because it's well known. New construction can change that, redevelopment can change it, but they'll still be relatively minor compared to the variability that we can see with water demand. Disadvantages are there will be additional administrative costs. And what we mean by this is basically we have to measure the impervious area. And this is typically done with aerial flyovers. And then somebody will go in there and actually, using a GIS system, measure the impervious area of each property. And there is some human error involved, which may come up in some other discussions we'll have. And the other disadvantage, that we've talked about, in discussing with staff, and this isn't necessarily a disadvantage, but we have it listed as disadvantage, but I'm reluctant to use that word sometimes, is that it will shift cost for paying for this to non-residential properties, because they tend to have more impervious area than sewer usage. So I'm going to turn it over to Keith now.
Okay, thank you. Keith Redling, also with Raftellus. Excuse the accent, please. Clearly, I'm not from Chicago area. I'm a North Carolina boy, but I have helped about 50 communities ponder the stormwater funding question over the last 25 years. And so to generate these revenues through a sewer rate increase is pretty understandable to everyone, I think. An impervious area-based charge is a little bit less commonly understood, although there are a couple thousand communities in the U.S. now that have these impervious area fees. And as Tom said, that data can be measured from aerial photography, and in fact, we have pretty good measures of the impervious area in Wilmette already. So we see a residential lot here. The purple is the measured impervious area. You see the house, you see the driveway, you see the sidewalk. And what we found from looking at residential properties in Wilmette is the typical residential lot, a lot with a house on it, has about 3,600 square feet of impervious area. And we call that an equivalent residential unit of impervious area. So if we were selling water, we sell water by some unit, 100 cubic feet here, that's 748 gallons. And in the stormwater utility business, the common rate is impervious area, and there's a unit for that, and it's often an equivalent residential unit, which is what we would recommend here. So it's about 3,600 square feet. The property that you're looking at here on Cherokee Street has about 3,800 square feet, so pretty close to the typical. And in the rate structure that we modeled and recommended, we'd have 3 flat rates for residential. I'm going to go into more detail on that in a minute. And I should have said earlier, I'm going to try to go, even though I talk pretty slowly, I'm going to try to go rather fast, and I'm happy to be interrupted. So here's a commercial property on Skokie Boulevard, measured impervious area you can see in the purple, parking lot and building. This is an office building. It has a little over 23,000 square feet of impervious area. And in a rate structure based on billing for units of impervious area that are equal to a typical residential unit, this lot has 7 times as much impervious area as a typical residential lot, and it would be billed 7 times as much on the variable charge. So 7 equivalent residential units. So that's how the impervious area works. And if we look at sewer versus stormwater, on the sewer side, which is the top table, about 76% of the wastewater usage in Wilmette is residential. So under a wastewater rate increase, something like 76% of the burden would be borne by residential. If you look at the stormwater units of impervious area, it's not a whole lot different. It's about 70% of the impervious area is found on the residential lots. The difference between the number of accounts and the number of properties is there are a few cases here where there's more than one water account or wastewater account for a given property. But there are also properties in Wilmette that would pay a stormwater bill that don't currently pay for wastewater, like just a parking lot on a lot. So they're a little different. I talked about a recommendation of 3 flat rates for residential properties. If I can direct your attention to the table, Tier 2 is the most common size impervious area on a lot here in Wilmette, and that's about 3,600 square feet. We looked at a frequency histogram of impervious area for residential lots and decided that there's enough variability in the impervious area that recommending 1 flat rate for all residential seemed a little coarse. And so we recommended 3 flat rates, with the middle tier being any property that had between 3,000 and 4,300 square feet of impervious area would be billed for 1 unit of impervious area, 1 equivalent unit.
So that histogram's not in your presentation, but for people who are interested, I think it's page 11 of your report.
Correct.
Page 11 of the PDF, page 7 of the report.
And that histogram has the typical shape. You know, it has a steep rising limb and a slow falling limb, and that's because there's a practical minimum amount of impervious area on a residential lot. There's really not a maximum.
Page 7, you said, or page 11?
Page 11 of the PDF, but page 7 of the report.
So these 3 tiers were chosen, and based on impervious area equivalency, in our recommendation, the middle tier would be billed for 1 unit of impervious area, the high tier 1.4, the low tier 3/4, and that breaks the residential ratepayers into roughly 1/4, 1/2, 1/4 between the 3 tiers.
And what was the math that went into determining the sort of the per tier rate? I get Tier 2, it's about average, so it's 1.
Yeah.
But why 0.75 and why 1.4?
Well, if we imagine that frequency histogram that I don't have a slide for, but you're able
But
to
I can
look at it, and
right?
you take the median at 3590,
Yeah.
if you start moving smaller and larger from 3590 to create a middle tier,
Yeah.
the wider I make it, the fewer properties will be low tier and high tier,
Yeah.
and the greater the disparity between the 3 rates. So just based on experience and looking at the shape of the histogram, what felt right to me was to make the middle tier wide enough to get about half the residentials in it. Then I calculated the median for the lows and the highs, and I did median divided by median and got
Okay.
0.75 and 1.4.
So stated another way, the average property in Tier 1 is about three-quarters the size of our average.
That's
And
right.
the average property in Tier 3 is 1.4, almost 1.5 times.
You
our
said it a
average.
lot faster than I did,
All right.
and accurately.
Well, just restating it to make sure I understood, that's all.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And the one thing I'll say is median and mean are not the same thing because it's not normally distributed data, but
But you were using median,
We
actually.
use
I see
medians,
yeah,
and that's
which
the
makes
norm
sense.
in this
That-
industry,
Yeah,
yeah.
that would make sense to me.
Keith, before you move on, can
yeah.
you talk about why you're recommending tiers as opposed to measuring every property for their exact
I
impervious
can.
surface?
So the basic rate structure is impervious area. And then the next question is, well, what will my unit be? And what I would advise, and what we advise here, is that we select a unit of measure that is fine enough to differentiate things that are significantly different, and coarse enough to minimize the village's money spent managing the data of measuring and capturing impervious area. And so what we think about when we think about that, if you go back to this picture, if we were charging, for example, by the square foot of impervious area with a very small rate per square foot, first of all, we can't measure it accurately within 1 square foot from aerial photography, so we're always off a little. And secondly, minor changes on each lot over time would cause the bill to change were you to seek to keep it right. So it's really the same reason that water meters don't register in quarts, and is that the unit of service here should be big enough to minimize our expenditure on data management and also to minimize the customer service workload that goes with tiny differences in everybody's bill, but fine enough that we're fair. And so based on experience, I feel like the equivalent residential unit achieves that with the 3 residential tiers. Where the housing stock really, really homogeneous here, I would have recommended 1 flat rate for residential, but it's not. And so at the end of the day, that really felt like the correct amount of detail.
And so the estimated $180,000 of administrative costs associated with this, and that's annual, right? That's an annual cost.
It is.
If you went to sort of an individual property by property basis, you're talking about, I mean, it depends on
Double
how
that,
fine you
yeah.
get. If you're literally down to the square foot, it could be 5 times?
Yeah,
more?
it could,
I mean,
particularly if you wanted to intercept change very frequently. So we have utilities that intercept change once a year. That's probably the most common. There are some that intercept change monthly or quarterly. And if you married the desire to be really accurate with a per square foot rate structure, it really exponentially drives up the cost to run the program. And my view on this is, foundationally, we're trying to find $4-point-something million a year to do debt service for big capital. And we want to find the balance here and not do anything too complicated.
And
Go ahead, Kathy.
I just had a question in terms of, I understand obviously the effort in terms of data collection and kind of getting this in place and things like that. I'm trying to understand, why is it an annual fee? Like, once you put the utility fee in place or whatever we decide, why is it the same amount, why is it the same amount every year? Because we'd have things like, and I just want to expand on that. So we have a permit process, we have a process in place that already comes and tells us when people are making changes to their structure, for lack of a better word. And so I'm just trying to understand kind of the additional cost on an annual basis for this. Does that understand?
What do we spend administering water bills or vehicle stickers or things like that? That's sort of like.
I mean, that's in.
But that,
yeah.
we'd have the same, we don't have an annual, if you look at we don't have an annual cost listed on the sewer fee, annual cost administering it, yet we're because so there, I could.
There is an annual
It's
cost.
built into
It's
the
not-
rate.
But that would still be there because we'd still have the sewer bill and the water bill. This is incremental.
Yeah, the sewer, I mean, the sewer fee is imputed in the water bill because it's based on water consumption, so, which, since the sewer fee is traditionally funded sanitary sewer, what comes out of the faucet is a good proxy for what's going down the drain. In this case, really, the number I'd be looking for, and I haven't been able to bring it up quick enough, is how many thousands and thousands of building permits are we issuing every year, because every building permit is going to alter the database at different courts during the year, and then it becomes at some point an unmanageable, on top of which, really, the purpose of the fee is to generate a very steady, recurring amount of money, because unlike the sanitary sewer where we're building a lot of, there'll be some amount of O&M in this, some amount of operation and maintenance, but the overwhelming bulk of it is going to be for recurring debt service.
Well, but aren't a lot of the building permits things like dumpsters and fences and
Yeah,
that, and
that's
that's
right.
not really significantly going to change the surface area that's impervious, is it? We're talking about structural changes and
We're talking about structural changes, flat work, patios, sidewalks.
And recombination, both of those will all, it's a property charge conveyed on the sewer bill, so property changes also impact it.
And we're a
It's-
fully developed village, and the number of permits that are actually used to do things that would affect the impervious area, I don't think is in thousands.
Oh, it most certainly is.
Really?
Yeah.
Especially on the flat work side.
Yeah.
So I should.
Maybe 1,000 is just what you're estimating as the administrative cost.
The incremental administrative cost, right?
So would we actually have to hire another person, or is that just, I mean, is it?
We would be
factoring
hiring,
that.
we'd be hiring another staff member for the
Yeah.
stormwater utility.
That's
At
my
least- at
assessment
least
too,
one.
and I left this out earlier, and I should have said it. I understand the sentiment to, that it might seem more fair to measure on a smaller increment. But there are a lot of limitations on the data that prevent us from being perfect to the square foot. And my judgment is you'd need at least one more human being to manage the information. The customer service workload would be significant.
Yeah.
Even minor changes to the property would change the bill.
And the 180, that really isn't sort of the startup cost, that's the ongoing cost.
That's
because
the
startup-
ongoing.
Startup cost is likely to be higher, given
That's what
everybody's going to get a new line item on their bill. What the heck is this, and how is this calculated? And you're saying I got 3,700 square feet? No, I don't think so, and,
Well-
have someone come out and measure it for me, and.
There are places that have tried the per square foot rate and it hasn't gone that well. It's very uncommon.
I can speak to that. I spoke with Winneca's staff. So Winneca has done it per square footage of every property. They do not recommend that we do the same. So their initial consultant and staff recommendation was the tiered approach that we have. They ended up going for square footage of every property, and their response is it is the most complex and most data-intensive process they could have selected. And it's very difficult to manage on an ongoing basis. So if they could do it all over again, at least, from a staff perspective, their recommendation is the tiers is the most practical approach.
Okay.
I just have a quick question. So the 180 is on the tiered approach already?
That's right.
Okay. And on the tiered approach, are we still, if you're basically in the same tier, are you still looking at building permits all the time? I don't know why you would need to continue to do that
For
unless.
commercial property, you would. For residential's, generally speaking, you wouldn't need to with the three tiers. And the majority of the $180,000 a year estimate is to manage the relationship between parcels and accounts in the Munis utility billing system and the incremental customer service and database maintenance associated therewith. So the impervious area maintenance portion of the 180 is relatively small. Now, managing the relationship between parcels and the Munis utility billing system has to be done whether it's per square foot or per ERU. But the impervious area data management and the customer service workload would go up a lot.
So wait, let me restate what I think you just said. You still have to map accounts to parcels, regardless of how you're measuring. If you're measuring by tiers, it's less likely that people are coming in, that you're managing your data as much, because it's
Right.
less likely people are going to move tiers. You're probably only going to move up tier, as a matter
Well,
of fact.
there are
not
only
down
two
tiers.
spots on the continuum where a tier can change.
Right along the edges, yeah.
And so That's right. So properties that are the mid-tier guys that are near the middle, they would have to do 500-600 square feet of stuff to make a change.
Which they probably couldn't do under our zoning ordinance anyways.
The big ones are already big, so they can't change unless they tear out things.
And we'll know which properties are on the edge of the tiers, so we can target our review of permits at the end of the year and really simplify it from the 10,000 parcels to a very small number and make it easier.
So we're not doing
Right, tear down, tear down, that's true.
No.
Tear-
This would be aerial photography based. This is how it's done.
Okay.
And, there are places in the country where the leaves never fall off the trees. We don't have that problem here. The problem we have here is the snow gone by the time the leaves come back. Because we have to see, if there's snow cover, you can't see the impervious features.
Right. Dan raised an interesting point. Tear downs obviously would be something you have to manage as you've got, or additions or whatever, that kind of.
And on the tear down front, the water customer goes away too. So when you think about triggering events that would trigger you to imagine that you need to go look and see what happened, building permits and also starts and stops on utility accounts are another, and subdivision and recombination. Those are really the triggering events, but they could be looked at annually would be the norm.
Actually, how,
Do we have a lot of subdivisions and consolidations? No,
No,
I
that we
think that's
don't.
an issue.
Yeah, that's a couple of year kind of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
What would you do on if somebody bought a 2,000, a lot that had a 2,000 square foot house or in this, and was going to build a 4,500, but it was going to take 18 months? What do you do during that 18 months? Where do they fall?
Well, the
Understand what I'm
norm
asking,
would
sort of
be that you would not charge for the increase until after the CO was issued.
Got it, okay.
And there are lots of places that would say the triggering event is the CO and new aerial photography that shows the improvement. And until I have both, I don't change the bill. There are places that do it differently, but that's probably the most common.
Right.
And
Just
for a
from
more
an-
stable place like Wilmette, I think it makes
yeah,
sense.
yeah.
Really, our motivation was try to be fair, but try not to spend money on the data maintenance where you can help it.
How much does Winnetka spend on its administration having this extra layer of detail?
I don't have that number. I can get that for the board.
How many parcels in Winnetka versus Wilmette?
They're about 4,200 parcels, mostly residential. So they're even heavier on the residential side than we are.
So
how
we're
many parcels
twice
do we
that
have?
big.
We're a little bit more than
More than
twice.
twice as big?
Yeah.
we have
Okay.
about 8,800 residential, I believe.
Okay.
Sorry, we got you off track there.
No, that's okay. Those are good questions. I already covered this slide. The punchline is around 70% of the wastewater usage is residential, and around 70% of the impervious area is residential. Under the stormwater fee, I talked about the tiers already. And so one of the things that's kind of important here, because we have a known revenue requirement for debt service, is stormwater fee is a very stable revenue source. Although theoretically a ratepayer could take out impervious area, it doesn't happen in real life. It's just really never happens. On the other hand, it will take a large increase in the wastewater rates to generate the money, and that will generate a reduction in water usage. So we have to forecast, there's enough demand elasticity on the water side that we forecasted reductions in demand so that we try to make sure, am I saying this well, Tom?
And this is a particular challenge. Basically, the fee would increase your water bill, and this is something we see everywhere. Everybody, and I heard somebody here saying this, everybody calls it the water bill, but it's really water and sewer.
Yeah.
And sometimes trash and
trash is on it too,
recycling
yes.
and things,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it's still the water bill. And just on the water component, this would increase the water bill by 40% if we did it on the sewer fee. And simple economics tells you that there's elasticity of demand, and if you raise the price by 40%, people will do more to use less. And so and that's important because ultimately what would happen is we would have to come in front of you and in front of the public and ask for an increase in the rates for water and sewer. And not to generate more money, but just to generate the same amount of money we're generating now. And quite frankly, this estimate of elasticity is just an estimate.
Well, we're seeing reductions every year regardless in
Well,
water
in-
usage from conservation efforts, new
Absolutely.
appliances,
And this is a
things like that.
spiel
so-
I give pretty much for every water and sewer rate study we do. We've been seeing a decline in per capita consumption throughout the country. Every region, whether they're doing well economically or whether they're not, there's declining per capita consumption, which is a challenge we're facing as utilities already. But yeah, if you raise rates 40%, you have to assume there's going to be some reaction to that dramatic increase. But I will be the first to tell you that reaction is a complete estimate. We would make one estimate, and chances are it's going to be incorrect. Hopefully it's too much, but if it's too little, then we might be back the next year saying we didn't increase it enough last time, now we need another increase just to get back to where we were. And so that's certainly a challenge with using the sewer use approach.
Thanks, Tom. And the other point I want to make here is that in the case of the wastewater rate increase or the stormwater fee, we modeled the rates to capture about 25% of the revenue requirements with a fixed charge and 75% with variable. And I will go into more detail on that in a few slides. So under the sewer rate increase, by the time we get to FY 2023, with the predominant revenue requirement on debt service and a small O&M, we need about 4.2. We need a little more than that under the stormwater approach because the stormwater fee will cost extra money to manage. The rate increase for a median residential account that uses 22 CCFs a quarter or 84 a year would be $122 fixed charge and all in $403. So the typical 84 CCFs a year residential ratepayer under the wastewater rate increase with the assumptions on elasticity of demand, $403 a year.
And that's compared to, what's the current average?
Current, it's on the next slide here. The current
Okay,
average
sorry.
is,
3 something, right?
500 or so.
356.
The current average is 356
Right, and it would
per
go.
year.
Okay.
So it's 356 plus the 4,
Yes.
40.
Is the total.
Right. So all in FY 2022, the typical residential bill would go from 356 to 759, the bottom right-hand number, so it more than doubles.
and that's just the sewer. That's not the water fee on it. That's just the 424 for the sewer fee.
Right.
And we have a
So
3-year
the
phase
quote
in here.
water bill is bigger.
Yes.
Okay.
So
This is just, I'm sorry, I think that's an important point. You're saying this 356 is just the sewer portion of the
Yep.
water bill?
Yes.
that's right.
What's our water rate today?
Is it 240? 241 is 240 is the
The
water.
240, and if it says 128 is the sewer,
So it's about another $200 on the water side per year.
No, isn't it more? If the
240.
average is 356 today?
Well, 84 CCFs times 240, it's about 200 a year.
Yeah.
Okay.
So right now, ratepayer pays typical 556, water and wastewater, and that would go to 960.
Right.
Yeah.
So the average person's paying about $200 for water is what you're saying?
Correct.
Right.
Okay.
Average water customer's 200. Residential. All right, on the stormwater side, we have the same costs, but we also have an estimated 180 a year for all of the things I laid out earlier. So the all-in revenue requirement at full burn in 2023 is a little higher, about 200,000 higher.
I just want to make one point. So we need to remember in looking at this, we also just increased water rates. Just so it might be helpful for us to be looking at the total impact to the resident.
Yeah.
As opposed, I mean, I know
I hear
what
you.
you're
Yeah,
trying to
that-
accomplish tonight, but for us to be looking at it, I think we can't forget that we also just increased the water rate.
Right, because there is one water bill as far as everybody's concerned. It's
Yes,
the bill that they
and
get.
nobody would understand that there's a water and a sewer component of their, I mean.
Even though I think it's on
there.
there, isn't it?
And stormwater, if the stormwater choice is made, that would be on there too.
The utility.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Water, your sewer, your refuse.
Yep.
And then the meter replacement charge, so it's a utility bill.
Got it, okay.
Okay, but.
Needs to be rebranded.
Under the stormwater approach, the fixed charge to recover about 25% of the requirement is $128 a year per account, and the ERU charge would be $300 a year. So at full burn in FY 2022, the typical home, Tier 2, would pay $300 for their impervious area, $128 for their fixed charge, $428. And Tier 1 less, Tier 3 more.
And before you go past that slide, so same exercise that you just did, is that fee on top of the water, what we call our sewer and refuse.
Right.
So
That's the incremental.
yes.
Okay.
So we looked at it as for something on one, and now there's the incremental here, but you're still adding that on top of the water and sewer. Okay?
But-
The other charges
but
have the
the-
other sewer fee on there.
But the bottom line is the average, I mean, it depends on how it's allocated to the commercial properties, of course, but the average, we still need 4.2 or 4.4 a year. It's just a question of how we divvy it up. It's not any cheaper if we do one choice or the other. It's just how do we divvy it up?
It's really, to me, a matter of revenue stability is number one because of the debt service obligation.
Yeah, and look, we've been dealing with water volatility for as long as I've been on the board, and I'm sure it's been as long as Tim's been here. You know, dry years,
Yeah.
more money than you need. Wet years like this year, we're going to be talking about it during budget time.
Well, even
So-
the sewer fund in between '08, '09, when the fund went into the red, and we had to cross-subsidize it from the general fund, was because we had 2 wet years in a row, and because the debt service on it and O&M was vulnerable to slack water demand. It actually finished one year with only about $1,000 in reserve, which is kind of disturbing. It was at the time.
Well, so far, we've talked about a typical residential wastewater customer who uses 22 CCFs a quarter, a typical residential impervious area customer, and the increment on their utility cost all in is pretty similar between the wastewater increase and the stormwater fee. Obviously, the more interesting question would be, what if you have a really big house and don't use much water? Or what if you have a really small house and you use a lot of water? Or what if you're a restaurant? So we have some examples of that, and we'll get into those in a minute. So the stormwater rate structure, all in, this really just kind of captures what was on the prior slide. The right-hand column, all in, on the debt service, typical home, $428 a year, little one, $353, big one,
Which is,
$548.
again, as we said, on top of the 356 that exists today, then plus on top of the couple hundred for the water bill as well.
Right. So if the water bill is about $200 on average, yeah, there you go.
This will be $1,000.
Close to double.
Pretty soon.
Yeah. And then the non-residential would be $128 for an account. So that office building I showed that had 7 ERUs, they would pay one charge of $128 and then 7 charges of $300 because they have 7 times as much impervious area as a house. So first slide here, we've, based on the impervious area data that we have from the village, which is pretty good, we can look at the residential lots in the village and thematically map Tier 1, 2, and 3, and we thoughtfully chose colors for Tier 1 and 3 that are nearly identical. Apologies for that. I'm mostly colorblind.
This was an interesting chart, and I'm sure all the trustees immediately went to their street to look and see where everything was, right? And just, of course. No, but a couple observations that I had. Like on my street, which I live on, we've got sort of 60-foot wide lots in general. And it's green and blue. The difference between the green and the blue is where your garage is located.
Right.
So we're right on the edge. So if you have a garage in the back and you have driveway going all the way back, you slipped into blue. If you had a garage up front, because it's Kenilworth Gardens homes where the garages can be, facing flush with the house, then you ended up being green. And obviously, the Indian Hill Estate lots are big, so they got more lot size, so they're going to end up having more impervious. But I'm curious, are there any other, if when you looked at it and you sort of look at were there any other observations that people had about what they thought impact, was? And, for example, I suspect some of the areas where we've got a lot of circular driveways, even if the lot was smaller, that would shove you into the blue category instead of the green category. So I don't know if there was anything else that anybody observed in their own casual.
Well, at what level, we talk about this as preliminary, but is this accurate in terms of impervious?
Well,
Does this do it already, or are we not there yet?
it's a great question. So we have impervious area data for the whole village, and it's quite good, but not perfect. I would say that this is 95% accurate anyway. Now, were you to choose to go the stormwater fee route, you could imagine different ways to do the tiering. I described the way I did it. I've done it a lot, and I trust my judgment, but there are lots of choices that could be made that would change the tier break points, and that would change the map. This is a feasibility study, but you have pretty good data, and this picture's not that off.
So that 95% is better than what we would say is directionally correct. The
Yeah.
data is better than directionally
It
correct
is.
here.
It is. And Michael made the helpful point earlier, although I don't recommend billing per square foot, the data you have, we use it to calculate a square footage to map to a tier. So we certainly know the properties that are very near the tier break points. And those could get additional
little bit of
quality control.
attention. Right, yeah, exactly.
That's right.
There are some areas that have, if you blow it up, a lot of black that isn't just, so I can't think of what this would be.
Is that non-residential, like
Yeah, so these are only the
Thornwood?
residential lots.
No, but this is actually black, not the kind of gray thing that looks like an aerial photograph. If you look like at the area that is just west of Thornwood Park, there's a lot of things that are like big black squares when you blow it up. And
When the lots are very, very tiny, the boundary that we have that's black kind of obliterates the color in the middle.
Got it.
Oh, so that might be
See,
like
those
a
are just
40
the boundary
foot
lines.
wide.
On the computer, it's just like my helpfully chosen colors. It's a lot easier to see those little things when you can zoom in.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Got it.
that's
Okay.
what it is.
But I don't know, that doesn't,
It doesn't look quite right, but
yeah, no, I'm looking at Thornwood.
do you see what I mean, west of Thornwood?
Yeah,
I mean,
or right north of Harper, there's like
Yeah, yeah.
two little green lines and a blue box.
Big black box.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the beginning of the meeting where we talked, this is very high-level concept, right? We need to, this gives us an idea, but we do need to dig in and make sure if we're going to move forward that we've got every property covered appropriately, and we would do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mike's right.
And this chart is helpful, but it's kind of a brainful too. And so stick with me for a minute. The sewer consumption, we divided into low, medium, and high. Medium sewer consumption customers are around 22 CCFs a quarter, and the exact range I wrote down on my cheat sheet, and that range is 15 to 3,300 cubic feet per quarter is medium sewer. So this is the middle row across this chart, is residential properties that use 15 to 3,300 cubic feet per quarter. High is above 33, and low is below 15. So if we think about customers who use a lot of water and thus pay a lot for sewer, under a sewer rate increase, they'll pay a lot more. They won't pay the average increase. They'll pay more than the average because they're more than average. On the other hand, the three columns are how these properties map in impervious area. So the first column is properties that would be low tier. Middle column, mid tier, upper column, high tier. So in my example, if we look at the bottom left-hand box, this is a low-tier residential ratepayer based on their impervious area who also uses less than average water. And under the low-tier residential, they would pay $353 a year for stormwater. That's an impervious area charge, the bottom left-hand number. The median of the water consumption for low water users would have their bill for wastewater at $255.23. So small sewer consumption, which is also on a low-tier residential lot, would do a little better with the wastewater rate increase. They'd pay $255 extra on top of today, whereas with a stormwater bump, they'd pay $353. And there are about 1,000. There are about 976 residentials that meet those two criteria.
This says single-family parcels, so this doesn't include the multifamily, which
No,
would
no
all be...
multifamily, no commercial, no
The
institutional.
multifamily presumably are going to get a huge break on the
Yeah.
impervious surface relative to the...
Right, because of their density.
Right.
That's
Right.
exactly right.
Yeah.
So,
I'm sorry, so
Yeah.
these are basically comparing the two different options. The gray is the
Also very helpful that they're very close in color here, too.
yeah, we strive.
sewer option, is the,
Gray is the cost.
and the blue is the stormwater?
Yeah, so if you look in the middle box, these are typical sewer consumption customers, about 22 CCFs a quarter. They're mid-tier residential, so they're average. And under a stormwater fee, they'd pay $428 a year. Under a wastewater rate bump, they'd pay $433 a year. So it's almost identical. And then the extremes are a big house, tier 3, bottom right, would pay a lot in stormwater fees, $548 a year. If they are a small water user, they would pay quite a bit less with the wastewater increase.
And I don't want to jump ahead to another punchline, but when we look at a map in the future, you're going to see that it seems clear to me that irrigation is one of the big water uses, and presumably size of family. You know, big family in a small house, you're going to get a break if you do stormwater fee. Small family in a big house, you're going to get a break if you do sewer fee. Are there other, in your experience, what are the other factors that sort of drive water consumption if you're not, watering your garden or your grass a lot, or if you don't have a big family?
Well, and one thing, I apologize for not knowing this, is are irrigation meters pretty common here for water?
No.
There's not a lot of sprinkler
Okay,
systems
so
in
if
town.
you have irrigation meter, obviously, the wastewater rates don't apply to that usage.
Oh, yeah, no, we don't have a
But
separate...
We do have separate irrigation meters. We don't have a lot in town, and even when we do, they do have to pay debt service. They pay the debt service component of the sewer fund. So they don't pay the full freight of the sewer fee, but they pay a portion.
But how
of
many
it.
of those do we have?
Not a lot,
Not many.
50 or 60, I think.
Okay, all right, okay.
So the question was, what are the other variables that would influence water consumption or that would influence?
But is that in this number?
It's all baked in.
It is baked in, okay, all right, okay,
It's all here.
okay.
So family size, irrigation, and weather would be the big three.
Okay,
Right,
right, weather
water
applies to
consumption.
everybody
Yeah.
sort of equally on a percentage basis at least.
That's right.
So you could suggest that, like the upper left-hand corner, high sewer consumption, low, that's like a
Small
big
house.
family, small house, and in the bottom right is, small family, maybe empty nesters in a big house.
Right. That's exactly right. And so the average ratepayer is the middle box, and it's about a push. But it's out at the margins where it's not a push.
Yeah, and I think your next
Yeah.
slide is,
Yeah, so here we see the impact. Those who would pay more under a sewer rate increase are the numbers in red. And those who would pay more under a stormwater approach are those numbers in black. And this chart just really depicts the same exact thing with a slightly greater amount of detail, which basically says if you're a smaller home, the break-even point between the wastewater bump and the stormwater bump is at a consumption of about 17 or 18 CCFs a quarter. That's where the numbers in the small residential column, where the stormwater bill is 353, where they go from black to red is between 15 and 20 CCFs a quarter. If you're a big house that would pay more under the impervious area charge, your break even occurs between 30 and 35 CCFs a quarter.
And 22 is the average, you said.
22 is the all-in average for single-family residential. If we go back to this non-residential example, the office building, their stormwater bill would be $300 at 7 units plus 128 fixed. That's $22.28. Based on their current wastewater consumption, their sewer fee would go up about $1,700 or $1,800. So office building, not a whole lot of water usage. They do a little better with the sewer bump. Different kind of commercial. This is the Starbucks and Jimmy John's property. So highly impervious like the office building. The difference is restaurants use more water. So in this case, it's not a huge difference. That's right. It's not a huge difference, but the bill would be more under the wastewater increase with this kind of property. On the policy front, we also pondered a system of credits that might provide for some adjustment in the bills for ratepayers who did something on their property that was helpful to the village. And credits, the idea of a credit for a stormwater bill is that the bill is based on a ratepayer's demand for service. We don't meter that demand like we do with a water meter. The estimated demand comes from the impervious area measurement. But a property with a given amount of impervious area that does something to mitigate the way their runoff occurs, with some stormwater utilities would be given a break, and that's called a credit. And so we looked at some various ways that credits might be applied here, including things like a low impervious area to gross lot area ratio. The thing that I would point out about credits is a fancy credits program where lots of measured things are given little discounts can be expensive to administer, and I don't recommend it. And the credits will drive up the rates. So just whatever we do to give
Still got to
someone,
pay 4.4
you still need 4.2.
million. Doesn't matter
either
where
way.
it comes from.
That's right.
That doesn't change. Now, in your report, you don't put it on the slide, but in your report, when you talk about residential credits, you say, I'm going to read it, and then I'd ask you to give us some color. So, due to substantial costs to the village of the stormwater improvement project and the fact that residential property improvements have a negligible impact on the performance of the stormwater sewer system, residential credits are not recommended at this time.
That's correct.
Any color to offer on that? I mean, other than I just read it.
I like the way you read it, and I wrote it. What I would say is that we're recommending 3 flat rates for residential, and there's a pretty broad range of impervious area that goes with each of the 3. The kinds of things that a commercial or institutional property might do that would generate a credit have to do with performance standards on capturing an amount of water. So a lot of times that would be like capture the runoff from an inch of rain. And if you think about the runoff from an inch of rain on a typical residential lot in Wilmette, the ERU is 3,590 square feet. So say 3,600 square feet. If you put an inch of rain on 3,600 square feet, you get 3,600 inch feet of water. And if you divide that by 12, 300 cubic feet of water is 1 inch of rain on all the hard surface areas. So 300 cubic feet times 748 gallons, 7.48 gallons, 2,200 gallons of water. So the idea that a residential ratepayer could capture 2,200 gallons of water it's not easy to do. And most of your ratepayers are residential, so our recommendation is the simpler approach. It's also the norm. There are lots of stormwater utilities that offer some commercial, some residential credits, but there are lots that don't.
And for comparison, Winnetka has a residential credit program, but it's similar to what Keith is describing. You have to capture 50% of your runoff to receive the credit. They've had one property in the years since they've implemented be eligible for it. So
Coming
it's-
up with the administrative procedures to manage that for what likely would be fewer than 5 ratepayers, just, it is not very good value,
Well, and
is
one
my
of the,
take.
one of the comments that you made about the elasticity of demand on water consumption, you also sort of said, look, and people aren't going to change. Now, obviously, if they're in the middle and they've got a lot of distance to go, even if you went square foot, is it likely people are doing a lot, to reduce 20 feet, 50 feet, 100 feet? Because the impact on the bill, I mean, we do the math. You're probably talking about a lot of effort for $20 or $50 a year of savings kind of thing. Does that happen? Do you see that
No,
happen?
people, if the choices were made based on economics, no residential ratepayer on any stormwater utility I know would go in and build things to get the break. It costs too much money to build the thing to get the break. And actually, that's generally true even on commercial properties, is it's very expensive to retrofit a property to manage stormwater.
But if they were tearing up the parking lot anyways or
Right.
something like that, if there was some sort of major construction project taking place and they said, okay, the incremental cost, we're already doing a big chunk of the cost, the incremental cost might be this. If we put this in, we might get a return on that.
That is
in that.
precisely correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that was another question I put to Winnetka. Since you've implemented the fee, have you seen a change in how residents approach zoning requests or building permit requests? And they have not. So the fee has not changed the behavior to reduce that impervious surface to pay less.
Well, and my worry when we started these conversations was that impervious surface would become a commodity. And so if we were charging by the foot, that people would come up to the zoning board, maybe not right away, not right after we implement them, but 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and they say, I don't know why you're telling me I can't have this impervious surface. I'll pay the extra freight. I don't care about that. And it becomes just an economic trade, which is not what we want. We want to have people to, manage their impervious surface more responsibly. But once you put a dollar cost on something, then people tend to think about it just purely in those kind of ways. I mean, there's that great example from the Freakonomics book about the nursery school that wanted to lower the number of parents that showed up late, and so they instituted a fee, and more parents started showing up late because it just became, well, I'm paying the fee. I'll pay the fee. I don't mind about the fee. I'll be late, and that's not what the school wanted. It was completely backwards from what they really wanted.
But I
So-
think from, a policy standpoint, I think a lot of people in Wilmette were wanting something that would incentivize lowering your impervious surface. And I think, as we look at this economically, it's not feasible to go house by house. So what else can we do, as a village, as a board, to, incentivize impervious surface? I mean, if people are thinking, if I'm already in the top tier, I'm not going to be paying more anyway. It's
Well, we
something
still-
that we need to kind of.
Yeah, I mean, and there are, I'm not sure it's around impervious, but you can't have like a credit program for doing things. They just don't, the recommendation isn't to change the rates, it's to maybe offer a one-time incentive or something like that, right?
Right, we
And
currently-
that's the
Couldn't we do that
recommendation
in
in
a
the
permitting
report.
process, too?
So there's a
Couldn't you
couple
just
things that we do.
Do something in a permit fee and take that separate from this.
Yeah.
Make this separate, there, and then when they come in and, if they're removing impervious surface, or if they're rebuilding or adding on, and incentivize them to minimize that.
Well, I mean, we still have
Yeah,
zoning.
permit fees. Well, that's what I mean.
It's not like our zoning rules don't apply all of a sudden.
No, I get that, but I would, rather than adding on more complexity here with the credits, couldn't you do that in the zoning process or the permitting process when you come in, in our rate sheet?
In other words, reduce permitting for things
Correct.
that are environmentally responsible.
There's a couple things. We could do that. You could look at your zoning code and how it rewards use of impervious surface in terms of calculations that we look at on a regular basis for variances. You could have a grant program. We have the Rain Ready program already in place where you're providing grants for rain gardens. We can extend that. And Winnetka's report had recommended $20,000 a year in grants for that type of work. So there's a lot of different ways we could approach that outside of a credit program attached to this funding mechanism.
I mean, the main benefit to a built property to reducing the amount of impervious is to control water on the property itself. which is the Rain Ready program that we're running now, which we'll have to talk about funding next year because we've been inundated with applications for it. It's proven to be very, very popular.
Good.
So it's a victim of its own success in terms of running out of money faster than we thought it would. But that's an example of how we can incentivize the behavior that we're looking for outside of this rate structure too.
Well, and when you have credits, aren't you really just shifting the cost from one person to another? You're
Yes.
not reducing the cost, because the debt service is the debt service is the debt service. And if you give one property owner a credit, we just have to collect it from somebody else.
Right, I guess the hope, though, is that the system works better at the end of the day. You know, like, there's less of
Yeah,
it,
yeah,
and
yeah.
then,
Oh,
you know,
yeah,
it's
yeah.
more effective.
Well, and I think what Trustee Plunkett was saying that I do agree with is, I mean, this is very broad, but, you know, we are looking very broadly to continue to reinforce reduction in impervious surface. I mean, we're in this situation because of the amount of building and things like that that have occurred in our community over 100 years or 100-plus years or whatever. So maybe this isn't the right place to be doing it, but I think Senta's point is something we can't forget, which is we need to find ways to incentivize people to do this, because otherwise you're only going to be in front of another board within 20 years or whatever, which you're going to be at some point anyways, but to ask for more money, because this is only so I think it's something we as a board really need to address. And again, maybe not here, but what we can do to encourage people to look at ways to reduce impervious surface on their property.
I mean, I agree. It's just a question of
It's just maybe not
the
here.
complexity of doing it in this.
Here,
There's
right.
other ways
Right.
to do it. And that, you know, and again, they're in the report. I mean, it said you can do, I mean, it says right on the slide, consider offering one-time incentives in lieu of credits. I mean, there are ways to do that. If you do this, we will pay for part of it, or if you do this, you know, here's $200 or $500 or whatever the right number is, you know, for doing that.
Right. We recommend against any exemptions. So our take on this is it's a utility, just like water and wastewater. And our approach would be that ratepayers who should pay under a stormwater fee based on their impervious area should pay. We did look at tax capped entities because
Actually, would you flip back the slide before? I think we sort of didn't talk about that as much. You did mention it, but we sort of got
Yeah,
sidetracked.
I'm sorry, I went kind of fast, but our sense on tax capped entities is that things like parks and schools could have lots of pervious surface on their lots. And we have seen communities that have offered a credit for a larger ratepayer who has a low impervious area ratio. The idea being that the green space they maintain on their property partially mitigates their demand for service. And so that's not uncommon in the business. We also have seen stormwater programs where a credit was offered for a specific partnership opportunity where the village, for example, needed a regional stormwater control and was able to utilize some parkland for it. And we've also seen credits offered for education programs that target, most commonly, say, about 8th graders, children on the importance of water pollution control, but also on, you know, when things flood, be careful, things like that.
But the low impervious surface area to sort of gross area metric is sort of consistent with the theme here of you pay for what you use and need. And in essence, it's like an offset. So the Park District has lots of impervious, but they got lots of green. And so that green is helping. So that sort of makes sense to me that you could apply that to, well, Frank, to any larger, but the reality is, who owns lots of green property in Wilmette? It's really just the parks and the schools, right? That makes sense to me regardless for the larger.
Yeah, and I think
owners.
it's an issue where the details would need to be fleshed out in an implementation phase. It's well beyond
beyond
the
what you're doing
feasibility
here today.
study.
Yeah.
But we did want to at least look at some of these tax capped properties because they're always of interest. And so that's my segue. Some of these would pay a good bit under a stormwater bill.
Actually, if you could go back to that slide again, this, low impervious area to gross area ratio, ratio, excuse me, I wondered, just in terms of, I think I know the answer, but why that couldn't apply to residential because for residential properties, you could have the same thing where you could have a home, a fairly large lot or a double lot, and have a small home on that lot, and the same thing potentially could apply. And I'm just curious, I'm just kind of curious why we're talking about it. It's like, I guess, a bigger question about how we got to kind of total square footage of impervious surface as opposed to a percent kind of to the size of the property, and why are any communities doing it a different way? And
Okay, so let me back up and talk about a rate structure based on percent impervious. So a rate structure based on percent impervious, there are a few utilities in the U.S. that use that rate structure, but it's not just percent impervious. If I had a 5-acre lot, 10% impervious, and you had a half-acre lot, 10% impervious, they're both 10% impervious, but communities that use percent impervious would say it's your percent impervious times the size of your lot, which is impervious area.
Yeah, right.
So there are no utilities that charge based just on percent impervious. They charge based on percent impervious times the gross lot area, which gives you the impervious area. Right. So now, the second question is, if a credit for lightly developed property could exist for a large ratepayer like a park or a school, why not for a house? Well, it certainly could. But there are some differences in the way that stormwater behaves on a smaller residential lot versus parkland. And one is, if you think about the impervious area on a residential lot, it's right up against the property line because the lot is small. The downspouts may be connected into the street already. So the idea that you have some green space may or may not really correlate to whether any of your runoff is blunted by the green space.
So can I restate it? Like, the water that lands in your driveway doesn't go onto your lawn, it goes into the street.
Right.
And the
so
water that lands on your house probably ends up there too. Yeah.
Here's some other things that matter. What kind of grass do you have? What kind of shrubs do you have? Which way is the wind blowing? How steep is your lot?
How's it graded?
Right. And so what happens is it's a slippery slope as you try to imagine refinement. On the other hand, if you limit yourself to large, lightly developed properties, that's not such a slippery slope. They really are different.
Yep.
And that's why the recommendation is what it
Makes
is.
sense. It's better than I thought. The answer was just going to be it was too complex. So, that's a much better answer.
We would love to do it for you. But I wouldn't recommend it.
But on that, so, I mean, not only are we talking about the gross ratio, we're talking about the tax caps. I mean, we're all kind of in this together, and the public schools can't raise their taxes. So if we charge them a significant amount more, that comes out of their education funding. The same with the park district. Now, the village, we can raise taxes, but these entities can't. So I think residents have to understand, doing this means a little bit less for your children at school, or a little bit less. I mean, I guess you could raise your park fees, but I mean, I think the whole tax cap entity is, a policy consideration to think of too.
I think it's a very important matter for this body. For us as utility advisors, it's a utility charge, and it's not based on tax status. And so it certainly has to be grappled with by the trustees. I'd certainly understand that, but we can't really recommend an exemption based on tax status, and we don't.
Then you'll also run into, I mean, let's be realistic here. Once you say there's a break just based on being a school, well, what about Baker, Loyola, Regina, St. Francis, St. Joe's? They're not taxing bodies, but they're schools. And then what about the churches and the synagogues? I mean, they're not going to be happy about a big new bill coming, and so you'll hear people say, well, that's not fair. And depending on how far you exempt, you might end up with Plaza del Lago, Westlake Plaza, and Eden's Plaza being the only three people that you're not exempting in some crazy way. So there's a lot of conversation to be had on this, because people will be expressing their point of view. But to the point he made, which what I said, having a lot of green space That's something you can sort of measure, and you can say you either got it or you don't. And by the way, the parks and the schools happen to have it, which is nice. And then it's also consistent with sort of the theme of, what's your impact on the system, right? So there's a lot of, you bring up a point, Senta, that's absolutely on the mark, and there's a lot of conversation when you really start to think about where it goes that might happen here, so.
Well, and as you would expect with properties that are not huge water users, the schools are a little bit more, that the impact on them of a stormwater fee is greater than that of a wastewater increase. And so we calculated a few.
And on this slide here, Board of Education is District 39. That's just how it shows in our water billing system. So we'll clarify that in the future. The column on the right is the sewer bill those entities paid in 2017. So they do pay a sewer fee now. So if you look at Avoca 37, they're paying $5,400 now in the sewer fee. So the incremental difference between a sewer fee increase and a stormwater fee is about $10,000. Right? If we increase the sewer fee, they'd be paying about $10,000. If we had a stormwater fee, they'd be paying $19,000.
Is that, so no, those are just the increases, aren't they?
The first two columns are the
Right,
increases.
so the delta for Avoca is 19 less 5, not 19 less 10.
Well, they're already paying 5 on their sewer bill.
Right, and they'd still continue to pay 5.
They continue to pay 5 if we.
And then they're either paying 5 more or 19 more.
Correct.
Okay, yeah.
That's well put.
Yeah, right, not 10. Yeah, exactly. That's what I was saying.
Well, what I'm saying is at minimum, they're going to pay 10 if you
Right.
increase the sewer fee.
They're going to pay 10 or they're going to pay 25,
Correct.
roughly.
Right, that's right.
Oh, the total.
Yes, Bob, thank you. Thank you, Bob.
Right.
That is-
Not 10 versus 19, 10 versus
Right.
25, yeah.
So the point of this is they're not exempt from the sewer fee now. They are paying a charge. The stormwater fee would just be somewhat significantly
But the
more.
park district would double. Correct. Roughly, is what it looked, if you went to the stormwater fee. They go from 96 to 200 plus.
210, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, one-
their addition is $100,000,
Right.
Yeah,
so it is more than double. It's going from 96.
yeah, but it's gonna go up by 65.7, so the.
If it was the sewer fee, it would go up by 60, right, that's right.
So-
Yeah, the net is more like 50 grand.
Exactly.
Right.
It's
The
either
delta's
50 or
50.
100,
Like
yeah,
50%,
Right.
as opposed to, yeah.
Right.
yeah.
But I just wanted to go back to a question you had said, President Blinsky, about, you could think about, you got to be careful in terms of these exemptions. You got to be careful in terms of exemptions and things like that, because once you do it for a non-taxing body or whatever, then it gets into grayish area. But I just want to ask a question about, and then we talked about, obviously, where there's a lot of green space, it makes sense. But I want to go back to the previous slide, because we do have, let's just use Eden's Plaza as an example. They potentially could be making some changes. We don't know what those could be, and they could be doing some significant stormwater retention on site. No different than what we've had with other applications that have come in front of us. And we would want, it seems like we do, again, want to encourage stormwater retention on their sites, going to our whole encouraging, impervious surface thing, reduction in that. And so we would want, I feel like that would be something we'd want to include.
Oh, I agree with that. Now, the question, though, is, for a lot of these big commercial properties now, the MWRD requirements and our requirements are not insignificant. So presumably they're doing the work anyways, and now you get back in that incremental conversation. We're like, gosh, if we have to build a vault this big just to comply with the MWRD, why not build it 1.5 that, and then I'll get a break on my bill?
Well, and
too,
that's our
kind of
first
thing.
bullet under non-res, is improvements that exceed the requirements of the village or MWRD, structural controls. We would recommend a credit for those,
Well, and that's what
which
Loyola
is
did.
what you're,
Well,
Loyola
Loyola
took
had to
up-
do it to comply with the MWRD, as did Baker. Baker spent a
Right,
bunch of
but
money.
they went above, I think, if I recall, they went above what MWRD required, Loyola. And they took up a lot of pervious, because they took up a lot of pervious.
Yeah, that's right. I think you're right. That they did more than required because they were adding to the parking lot there.
Right, and based on the, yeah,
Yeah.
any other
And
questions
we
on this
appreciate
slide?
that.
correct. So do the neighbors.
We talked about this earlier. Managing the relationship between parcels and the munis utility billing system, some data maintenance that's relatively minor based on our unit of impervious area, customer service, technology, and administering a modest credits program. we think the cost is about $180 a year. And the implementation of a stormwater fee, were that option chosen, would require us to refine and finalize our rate structure details. This includes how multifamily and multi-metered properties would be handled, how the credits might work, finalizing impervious area, finalizing the linkage between parcels and the utility billing system, finalize the financial plan. You need to codify an enterprise fund ordinance and a rate ordinance.
So this would be a new fund, water fund, sewer fund,
I think
stormwater
that's
utility
a
fund?
policy discussion we could have with the board. You could do a stormwater utility fund. You could also put it into your existing sewer fund.
Yeah, it's almost 50-50 how that's done. Those are the two ways.
So if you put it into your existing sewer fund, your need to build the reserve in the immediate term is lessened because of the reserve levels we have there. So that may lower the rate a little bit, but we are going to have to increase that reserve over time because we're pulling it down for existing debt service. So that's something I think we would work on with Melinda and the finance committee to look at what's the appropriate vehicle in terms of setting this up.
Well, I think we need to clarify, too, that right now we're only talking about the new neighborhood storage stormwater improvement. And we spend a lot already on stormwater that would, for right now,
What goes under this or
remain.
the other, yeah.
All the improvements on the east side are currently in the sewer fee, all the maintenance are in the sewer fee, and so I think we need, and maybe in the future, as this debt service rolls off, we add more to a stormwater utility. But I think, people need to understand that there still will be a sewer fee that, consists of sewer maintenance and all of that, that's still based on your water consumption if we decide to go with this.
Right.
Yes. So those would be some of the steps. They could be done in about 6 months, roughly. And the things that would influence the speed really have to do with the the choices made on the continuum of simple to complex. But about 6 months is, I would say, as fast as it could go. One of the things that's kind of important is to think about public outreach and messaging. Were the village to do a stormwater fee, it's harder to explain than a wastewater rate increase. And some amount of effort would need to be devoted toward that. So we gave some thought to that in our report. And that public involvement and outreach strategy, some general outreach. Once you knew exactly what the rates were, then outreach can shift into a different kind of outreach where you could specifically talk with ratepayers about what their bill would be. The utility bills are quarterly. These are typically billed in arrears. So if the effective date of the utility were something like January 1, 2020, then it would show up on bills about a quarter later.
Questions, anyone?
I just have one other question. When you recommend a fixed fee portion of 25%, where does the 25% come from?
It comes from our judgment, and it doesn't have to be 25%. Our judgment is that if you try to imagine the things that are causing you to incur stormwater cost, those things are allocable to different units in a cost of service kind of mentality. And the most significant one is impervious area because it generates runoff. But ratepayers place a demand on you for service because they exist too. They drive on your infrastructure during a rainstorm, and they receive a bill and pay it or don't pay it, and you have to pursue it. And so it's not unusual in utilities that some of the cost is allocable to a fixed charge. And on stormwater fees, it wouldn't be uncommon for that to be around 25%, and that's why I recommended it.
Do you think that's the industry standard, or becoming the
I
industry
don't.
standard?
I think that stormwater utilities, although there are a couple thousand in the U.S., and I've been helping set them up since '91, there's more variability in how they do things than water and wastewater. It's a much newer utility than water and wastewater. So I would not say it's the industry standard. I'd say the most common is 0. But in newer utilities, it's more and more common that some of the costs are allocable to a fixed charge. So the rate making has become a little more complex over time. In early days when I was working on this, there was an ERU rate and that was it. So it's evolved a little bit. And let me say one other thing. Your choice in how much of your cost is allocable to a fixed charge influences the way the burden is shared between classes of ratepayers, right?
Right, exactly.
Each residential ratepayer is an account, but they're only one ERU or 0.75 or 1.4, and a large commercial institutional is just one account. So raising the fixed charge shifts burden to residential. Lowering the fixed charge shifts burden to non-residential.
There's actually also been a shift to increase reliance on fixed charge even in the water and sewer utility industry because of the desire for more revenue stability.
Well, the village manager mentioned that earlier, is that the truth is it doesn't cost that much less to run the wastewater utility when water consumption drops. A lot of that cost is about maintaining infrastructure that's fixed.
Mm-hmm.
So this shift has been to seek revenue stability.
So you could, I mean, to your point on the water side, for example, you know, when you look at our operations, there's a fixed cost and a variable cost, and some of that fixed cost could be allocable on a fixed basis to I mean, if you think about
You have to
our
be careful of how you define fixed cost, because the reality is for most utilities, a vast majority of the costs are fixed, because the example
Right.
I always
It's
use
the
is
capital
if
investment,
we
yeah.
have a 10% decrease in consumption, we can't stop paying 10% of our debt service, we can't
Right.
lay off 10% of our employees, we can't get rid of 10% of our vehicles. Most of our costs are fixed. So that's how some people, they're like, well, let's just put all our fixed costs in the fixed fee. But the reality is, if you define fixed costs
It
in a
would be too
reasonable
much.
manner, you can't.
They become
so
huge.
it becomes a policy decision how much of our costs are fixed, because there's, and it's less a concern here in the village of Wilmette than other places, there's an affordability concern, because the higher the fixed cost, that goes against affordability a lot of times. So that's what a lot of utilities have to grapple with. That's less a concern here in Wilmette than most places, but
Still
something
concern.
you can't ignore. You probably have retired people. You
Still
probably still
concern.
have people who are retired on fixed incomes here.
yeah.
Well,
Plenty of
and that's illustrated in our water fees, actually. We have a fixed monthly charge, whether you use a drop of water or not. It's not high, it's less than $22, but, and the fact of the matter is our variable costs are really power, chemicals, and a few other things, but the chemist is still there, the lights are still on, the operator's still sitting there, the computers, the SCADA system, everything else still.
That service still got to be paid. And,
Yeah.
Yeah. Kathy, you had something?
I was just going to ask, you said you have a lot of experience in this, and obviously we have to make a decision here. So just based on, obviously think times have changed, but over the last 12 months, based on other communities you've, been working with, what's the, how many of them have implemented something like a stormwater fee, and how many have been consistent and gone with their sewer fee? I'm just curious, just based on your professional experience, just kind of.
But presumably there is a skew if you were willing to hire them. You're at least considering it. Like that would exclude all the people
True.
who
True.
haven't
But I
bothered to think about it.
yeah, that's fair.
Against that, because Keith is a relatively new employee of Raftellus, because stormwater is actually only something we
Yeah.
started to get heavily into. How long have you
When
been
I
working
started
with
the
this?
practice, 2011.
2011. I mean, we used to be primarily water and sewer, but the reality is when you're looking at a large capital investment that's stormwater specific, I would say that answer is close to 100% it's a stormwater fee.
It is. One of the things that makes it, stormwater is much more common with a large capital need like this. One of the things that's pretty different about Wilmette is that most of the wastewater consumption is residential, most of the impervious area is residential. If you go to, say, Pittsburgh, which is one of the bigger cities I'm working in right now, maybe 70% of their water consumption is residential, 70% of their impervious area is commercial. So the choice is way more stark when you look at, quote, the impacts, right? And so that's one observation. Another is, it's routine that people use both sources of monies now. Places that need lots of money. The place I'm working that needs the most money is New Orleans, as you can imagine.
Right.
So they have dedicated millages for drainage. They have drainage paid for with wastewater rates, and they're pondering a stormwater fee, all three. Their snow removal cost is lower than yours, so that doesn't balance it out, though.
So what I think you're saying is the impetus for talking about this is a big project like the one we're looking at. And if you have a big project, a lot of people are opting for this path
They are.
as their answer.
They are definitely, and some of the communities I'm working in that are not tremendous, like New Orleans or Pittsburgh, Carlisle, Pennsylvania, Westford, Massachusetts, these are places about the size of Wilmette. And they don't always have lots of flooding problems. Westford, Massachusetts really doesn't have any flooding problems, but they have some aging infrastructure and some water quality. But what they don't have is the ability to raise taxes unmitigatedly. They have Prop 2.5. They can only raise taxes a little bit each year, and they're already maxed out on that plan. And they don't want to reallocate the cost to another wastewater increase.
So it's a separate fee that gets around whatever.
The biggest
Legal
selling
issues.
point here is the revenue stability of the drainage
Yeah.
fee is very high. The revenue stability of one tied to water consumption is more variable. To me, that is the single biggest difference here between the two for you. You're not 70% impervious commercial, 70% water consumption residential like the big stark changes like a lot of big cities are. But the revenue stability would be different.
So stated another way, what you're saying is, in the cities where there is that difference, what you really are is allocating it to a different user, to a different type of user, whereas here, it's still the same type of user. On the edges, you may be moving it around a little bit, but at the end of the day, we're 70% residential on both measure, and so residential is paying the bill here.
That's right. So if you go to Pittsburgh, what they would say is we have lots of basement backups and lots of flooding, and it's
And it's
coming
the
from this
commercial
big
guy's fault.
impervious area,
Yeah,
parking
right.
lots, and parking decks that don't even have a water meter. And we can't tolerate the unfairness of it. That's not your issue.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the chart that you have on, I forget what this is, page 8, it just demonstrates that.
Presentation or the report?
The presentation.
Okay.
So the sewer usage fee, broken up between residential and non-residential, 76.24.
Oh, yeah.
And then you do it by stormwater fee, and it's 70.30. That's just not
close.
much of a difference.
Keith keeps saying that. From my perspective, I come from a little different perspective than Keith. I work more on the water sewer side. Usually Keith is the stormwater guy. If you look at the difference between 24 and 30, though,
Yeah.
that means under that option that your residential is paying 25% more, roughly.
That's true. You're right.
Now, part of that gets taken away by the fixed fee component, so that's not, that math isn't exactly right, I will caution you. But it's really the difference between 24 and 30 then,
That
that you need
matters.
to consider.
I'm an
Yeah, but
engineer,
it's
not an
the-
economist.
It's not the sea change of
No, it's not.
70,
But it's
30,
still
30,
25.
70
It's
kind of,
still
yeah,
25%.
yeah.
It's not, yeah.
Yeah.
Questions? All right, this was very helpful, and don't go away, because we may call you back up here in a second. Anything the staff would like to add, or Melinda, or any questions for Melinda?
I've got a question for Mike, maybe for you. Are there other suburbs beyond Winnetka that we should be looking to learn from their experience?
The one that comes to mind that's had a utility for some time is Downers Grove. Not a lot around the North Shore have one, but I think we can reach out to Downers Grove and learn a little bit more about their experience. I think theirs has been in place at least 5, 7 more years than that, so that could be some helpful insight as we
Do you
move
think we
forward.
should do that?
Yeah, for sure. That's a great suggestion, Peter. And was theirs precipitated by some big investment as well?
I'm not certain.
Okay.
Mike, could I add Park Ridge to your outreach
Sure.
effort?
Joel, do they have one, or I think they were talking about one.
They do, and I think they may go that extra step of trying to have it customized to the property, so I know they're probably a bigger community, but I just wonder if you can make that outreach.
Not much. What's Park Ridge's population?
more than ours.
Is it? Okay.
Oh.
It's not that much more, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
President Malinsky.
It's not
you-
like
you-
Evanston. Yeah.
In terms of next steps, we're not looking for any final decisions tonight from the board, but if there is support of the concept that we should continue studying and looking into implementing a stormwater fee, I think we'll want to start the back end work to be prepared to set it up and be ready to bill on January 1. And we can always stop that and go back to a sewer fee, but the sooner we start that, the better. And that would incur additional costs from Raftellus in terms of implementation, but I would want to move that process forward.
Yeah, so I'll pause on that for a second, because before we sort of do that, I'd like to offer the opportunity for public comment if people want to comment. So if the board is done, Dan?
No, well, it's a Melinda question, because I know all the analysis, we're covering the 4.2 million of debt service a year, and that's what the rates were set at. But I also thought we were going to get some advantage because we have some debt service runoff.
Yeah.
So are we overstating this fee? Because, again, our debt service is coming down, and it's going to come down by almost $2 million in 5 years.
In the general fund.
In the general.
In the general fund. But also,
And you were.
also the
planning
sewer
on
fund is coming down by $1 million.
Water fund is
Water.
definitely.
And water fund's coming off in 2024. So are we overstating in this analysis? Or do we get to reset it every year based on the runoff of our debt service?
I'm going to say that.
Melinda, why don't you come up? This is a more substantive question versus the nod of the head.
Well, we're on TV too, so.
Right, that's why I wanted her to.
So when you're looking at the debt service structure right now, and yes, when we were contemplating this before and we said we didn't know which way we were going to go, how we would layer it in would be sensitive to how the sewer fund debt service is going to roll off over time. If now we're going to talk about a stormwater utility fee, it's going to be set up to pay the 4.2. What will happen on the sewer fund, though, is if consumption continues to decline, that just means we're not going to have to do a rate increase.
Right.
Because our debt service is lowering. So would it have been taken into consideration with all of this? Yes. I can tell you that I've had conversations with Mike to say, I think if we're going to go the route of a stormwater utility fee, I wouldn't recommend at this point that we would set up a separate enterprise fund. And it has to do with this issue, and it has to do with something that Senta was starting to talk about, which is maintenance issues and such. It is all related. So I think it should be a fee within the sewer fund itself and not a separate enterprise fund at this point as we've talked about it. So we're not overstating how much we would need from this fee. What would happen is what our sewer fee and what it pays for, it would change over time if we weren't going to have to do any other additional work.
Right.
And consumption remain the same.
Right.
And if consumption remained the same.
Got it.
So the bill would go down,
It should go down.
or should go down, assuming for making all-
If
all the
consumption levels stayed at what we had projected when we built our cash flow, when we even issued the original debt, if that all occurred, then and if we weren't going to now layer in additional debt to do what we'll call separate sewer work, then you are correct. The fee will come down at some point in time because the debt service piece would come down. And the stormwater fee would still be now for the stormwater.
But there's still reinvestment that we have to make
Yeah.
in the sewers anyway,
Yes,
so, yeah.
in terms of the distribution
Yeah,
system.
yes.
We should be realistic. The sewer fee is not going to come down because consumption continues to decline, and we have a CIP with millions of dollars of
That's where I
sewer
was
needs.
headed, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, okay, but to your point about the math, yes, okay?
Got it.
Right.
Melinda's there? Anybody? Okay. Wait,
I have a
Kathy?
question for Melinda. Just coming back to just this, revenue stability that we have if we were to go down the path of the sewer fee. So obviously, over time, we know that water consumption is going down, and we're seeing that. But I'm wondering, at this point, in terms of revenue stability, we also know that there's up and down years in terms of rain or no rain. But I just want to better understand from you your concern about revenue stability a little bit, because I think if we were to start to adjust starting today, if we were to start to adjust our thoughts on water consumption and adjust it, not based on all the things we've done in the past, but based on water consumption today, knowing that people are using less water, and that there's fluctuations, but one year it's good, one year it's bad. What's your perspective on revenue stability? because, I guess, is that too
Okay,
long
so
of a question?
I'm going to start answering back, and then you can tell me if I'm addressing what your concerns are. So I'll step back and just remind us again when we met and talked about the first quarter results. And in that presentation, I showed you what had happened with water consumption since 2011. So you saw when we had good years, and then you saw, especially in the recent past, we have not performed at where we had hoped or where we had expected. And it also helped you understand that we usually don't know just how the year is going to truly fall out until we get into like the fall months because of how we bill. When I look at where we're at now through the end of May, I could tell you our wholesale rates or consumption levels are down over 4%, getting close to 5% from where they were last year. And our residential is down about 1%. So what that tells me right now is wholesale, there's a month lag, but in residential, it's a 3-month lag. So I know going further, I'm going to be telling you residential consumption is down even more. And that shouldn't be a surprise because when we watch the news and they talk about weather, they're telling us how January through now, we've had the rainiest first 5 months of the year and who knows how long. Okay, so that's one issue. When we built the cash flows, when we issued the last series of bonds, it was a discussion that we had going back and forth about consumption and what might happen, and we built in the notion of declining consumption just because of behavior and what folks will be doing with their house and changing things out. So we had built that into the cash flow, and we had reduced our average assumed consumption numbers, but things have been lower than even that. The next thing I will tell you is in the discussions that I've had with Reftelis and that we've had internally, my number one concern is that the revenue source is going to be a stable revenue source to pay back that debt service. That is my number one concern. Do I know that even with the sewer fee that I'm coming back in water and saying it looks like we're going to have to do a rate increase just because consumption is down, but we're going to do it because we need that revenue to come in to make those debt service payments. As we have our discussion right now, what is my biggest concern is not so much the tiers and how we set that up, because that's going to be an administrative policy decision that we're making. It will be about exemptions that we're talking about doing and how we're going to project for that, especially if we're going to talk about exemptions that we're going to give for future development, because how do you build that into a rate structure that we're doing if one of the other goals that we're saying right now is when we build this, we want to create the rate once and live with that for the life of the debt service itself. So that becomes a concern of mine, what that means as we go into the future.
I mean, and I was whispering with Mike, so our existing sewer fund debt service is about $4 million?
Roughly right now, yeah. And
And
we
so
know
we're
it's
gonna-
going to decline over time. We had
Right.
projected for that.
But we're doubling it. And
Oh,
so
absolutely.
while the volatility, even if the volatility doesn't change,
Mm-hmm.
the dollars associated with the volatility will double.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so the depth or difficulty of the conversations that we're going to have around wet years will be twice as hard because there's twice as much a gap that will be created by shortfalls. So,
That could be.
Then we could have a drawing year.
It could
yeah,
be, right.
I don't think we've had a dry year since I've been on the board. Okay, so I can't remember
Which,
one. Can
again,
you?
to me, leads
Been a
to the
while.
conversation of keeping it in the sewer fund, so that way we can
Yeah, no, that
manage
makes
things
sense.
within all of it, within just the one fund.
I think it would just be helpful, I mean, we can talk about it at the end, but I think we should get some examples of what the utility bill is going to look like in all the different categories. And I would do it in the tier 1, tier 2, and tier
Yep.
3, and pick a house and mock it up and say, because I think what I'm hearing you say is, I'm going to get, on my utility, it's going to say my water fee,
Yep.
sewer fee, refuse, and then this stormwater utility. Basically
And
four things.
already you see that there's a meter replacement charge on there.
Right.
That's another fee that's on there. So yes, it is all the, and now we're talking about that we'll have one that's going to be called
Need to mock that up.
stormwater utility fee as well.
We can do that, and I think as part of our, if we proceed, as part of our public education, you know, we will have those mock-ups that we're communicating to
It's got to look
residents.
like the bill,
Yeah.
not go in and model it.
Yeah, not a spreadsheet, right. Okay. Thank you, Melinda. Okay. Any more, or I will open it up for public comment? Okay, so I'm going to open the meeting up for public comment. Just a reminder, under the village's rules, you're allocated 3 minutes to address the board. So would anyone like to address the board? Jan?
Jan Barshes, 1500 Sheridan Road, lived here forever, it seems.
You've been on the library board forever, too.
Yes, well, not forever, but what I'm wrestling with right now is the idea that all these fees are going to come into play. You're going to have to, as a resident, you already pay in taxes for the library. You already pay in taxes for the park district. Isn't that going to mean doubling or tripling what the individual pays in taxes if all these fees come into play? Because there's nobody, the library is not going to pay for it. We are going to pay for the library to pay for it. Same with the park district, same with the other entities. So my question is, are we going to have to start putting coffee cans full of change in our house somewhere in order to pay these taxes?
Jan, are you concerned about the governmental entities or the individuals paying the taxes here?
Well, the individual is going to have to pay the governmental entity
Yeah,
taxes
okay.
too, and those are going up. And of course, our own fees will go up, individually. So is it correct in my assumption then that we're really going to have to come up with quite a bit of money individually?
We did, yeah. I mean, the answer is yes, that it's going to be paid for. And we did, way back when we were talking about this, there was a slide that Melinda put together that sort of had the total cost of service, which was property tax and your utility bill and your vehicle sticker and all that. And there was a comparison of that. And we can I don't know if that's on the website right now or not, but we don't have that all
It is on the
handy,
website from a former presentation, but we don't have it right now.
Yeah, we don't have it handy right now, but we have looked at sort of the total cost burden of it. And I mean, the average property tax bill
It's 14,000.
is $14,000, and our portion of that is $1,200 or $1,500, something like that. We talked about an average water bill of $200, sewer bill of $356, so now you're up about $2,000. I thought it was $3,000 though at the end of the day. So my recollection is the village's portion of people's overall tax burden was somewhere around $3,000, and you're right, this is going to be an extra $400.
It won't be more than that.
I think she was asking a slightly different question,
Okay.
if I can, because I think what she was asking is, right here, what we're looking at, and this is something residents ask us a lot about, right here, what we're looking at is the village portion of the property tax
Exactly.
bill. She's talking about the total property tax bill, and so if we increase, and so if we charge the school districts more or the parks more, that fee is going to come on the property tax bill
Yeah.
to the residents. So I think
Or-
she was asking just more, as we look at this, make sure we understand and communicate to residents if we can. And I don't know that we can, but I think she's saying if we can, we should be looking at the total impact to the residents, which I know we struggle doing, but I believe that's what you were getting at.
Yeah, no, and I think that's fair. The point, though, is to the extent, say, the parks or the libraries don't pay, well, then that ends up in the fee. Anyways, it's just, it's whether it showed up in your property tax bill as an extra $2 to the library, or you showed up as an extra $2 in the stormwater fee. At the end of the day, you're absolutely right, that there's an increase that has to come, and it's primarily from the residents, given the 70-30 split that we have, yeah.
Okay, that's pretty
Well,
hard.
the long and short of it is that the increases will be substantial.
Yeah,
And I
to
think
each
it's good-
individual
Yeah,
resident.
and I think it's going to
Yeah.
be really incumbent on this board and on the village to communicate this really, really well.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I don't even want to think about it.
Yeah.
Nobody's considering reopening the decision as to whether to do the project, I take it.
No, nobody has suggested that to me in any conversation. I'm speaking for everyone, but nobody has suggested that to me.
Right, so the cost of the project is the cost of the project, and that's already been decided. and there isn't any way to get it down. If there was, we would definitely
Right.
take advantage of it.
I think you'll also need to be a little careful of the residents who are on fixed incomes and, what kind of burden that's going to add to people like that, too.
No question. I mean, I remember when I ran originally in 2011, that was the same year we had the D39 referendum. And while you would talk to residents about village things, the only thing on everybody's mind was the incremental expense of the D39 referendum. And in
Yeah,
particular,
right.
I heard from a number of people on fixed incomes, and, the story is something like, you young people make a lot of money, and an extra $500 a year isn't going to, kill you. But for some of us, that's real money, and so this is real money. There's
Yeah.
no question about
We
it.
don't want to drive people away who've been here for years, but just don't
that's right.
have the income coming in.
Yeah, now the hope is that there is, besides the positive benefit of having, dry streets and dry basements, because this will help everyone in that respect, or everyone in the separate sewer system in that respect. The hope is that, as Wilmette becomes one of the leaders in terms of managing stormwater, that you might see a property value increase as well, as people, you don't have to worry about water in Wilmette anymore, like you do in whatever community or whatever neighborhood.
It'd be a great selling point.
Let's
But I have
knock on
one-
wood, right?
One last quick question, and I'm not sure I'm understanding this right. Are you saying that with this kind of program, whether you do rain-ready or whether you put in impermeable pavers or whether you make other modifications to your property, that's really not going to matter? That's what it sounds like to me. You can do it, but
No, I
it's
think,
not going to
I
affect
think the
anything.
conversation was it wasn't going to change the rate, but we could have incentive programs outside of this rate to encourage that behavior. So there would still be, and we have incentive programs today, and there's talk of other incentive programs. Just inserting it into the complexity of the rate was something that people were recommending against. So I think the conversation was that we wanted to encourage it. I think Senta brought it up, and a number of us
Right.
agreed with that.
I was glad to hear
And
that.
those type of actions will have a direct impact on non-residential like the library. So Keith, the library has a permeable paver parking lot. So that would be a credit to their bill potentially under the system we're talking about.
Yeah.
For institutional properties.
So if the parking lot is not impervious, you don't need a credit program. It
You
just
don't
won't be
charge it,
counted as
right.
impervious.
You're only going to be charged for the building then
If you have
for
stormwater
that.
controls in place that were subsurface or something like that, then a credit could address that.
So that would mean that the amount of taxes that the library would have to pay, or the extra, would be less,
Would
and
be-
therefore people,
Correct.
the residents would have less also.
Well, the residents would have to make up that difference because we still need $4.2 million to pay the debt.
Okay.
So it's good, instead of the library collecting it, the village would collect it on everyone else's bills.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jan. Anyone else? Okay, so I'll close public comment. We'll move back to Mike's comment, which is what I think the staff is looking from us tonight is this a path we want to continue down? Because there's work to be done, and if it's a path we're not interested in continuing down, you can let us know too. But that's, I think, what you're looking
Yes.
for. So I'll open it up, people's thoughts.
I think it is, which is surprising. I flipped, but it was actually, the presentation was outstanding. You guys did a great job and all that, but I think it's one we have to explore because I think it's the most explainable and manageable. And it'll be predictable with our budgets that are going to be very volatile over the next 5 to 6 years.
Yeah, the predictability is important,
Right.
and there is sort of an inherent, I think when we originally started talking about it, I was worried about complexity. But if you can manage the complexity, the fairness argument is strong, and then the revenue stability argument is strong as well from this board's point of view, from my point of view, and I believe this board's point of view. So it seems like, a route that we'd want to take.
I do have concerns on the other government bodies because it's very circular. It's going to come back to us and the residents to that point. And then the other, larger non-government properties like in Eden's Plaza or some of these private schools. I'd just like to see how we consider that.
Yeah, because
I don't think they should bear a lot of the burden of it just because of the size. but
Well,
because
remember how these leases typically work. So if there's a big stormwater fee at at Eden's Plaza or Westlake Plaza, that's not going to the owners of the plaza, that's going to Lou Malnati's and Bed Bath & Beyond.
Right.
So, and when it happens down here, where they, down here, buildings are going to have smaller impacts, 'cause they don't have big parking lots and the like. But, that goes to rent, that's not, the building owners don't eat that, they pass it on, so.
I began this process thinking that we should continue using the sewer bills, just for it's something we've done for years and years. I understand it. I think everybody understands it. But for the reasons that several us and you have described, we need predictability. And we don't need it for a year or two. We need it for 30-odd years. And it's a large number. And I don't really see a way of effecting that without doing something different. And the devil will be in the details. And the education here will be critical. But if we can do both of those, I think that that's the way we ought to be pursuing this.
I didn't have a preconceived notion of what the right answer was, probably because of my such a limited history on the board. But after reading the report, but even before the presentation, I thought the case for the sewer fee as opposed to just, or the stormwater fee as opposed to the sewer increase is just overwhelmingly strong. Partly because of stability and largely because of the equity issues. That still leaves us with decisions to make about how to treat capped entities and also the percentage fixed fee and some kind of minor details, but I think we can handle that.
Yeah.
I believe we can do that, so.
I'm sure our consultants and staff will help us.
That's right. But I must say that you did a terrific job. And not just because of the analysis you did, but the ability to explain it to everyone in a way that we can understand. I'm very, very impressed.
Perhaps another, also to echo, Trustee Kennedy makes a very good point in terms of stability as it occurs to me. We'll be preparing to talk to Spear and eventually to Moody's, and for an issue this big, to have the collection method that we will have established for the debt service is going to play a large, very large role in the rating assigned to the issuance. And to the extent that it's not subject to variability due to weather is going to be significant for them.
And I think in addition to the stability, which we obviously need, I think this adds to the transparency. I mean, yes, people probably don't want to see an extra bill, but when you have your bill itemized, it's very clear. This is my water bill. This is, this is the water that I'm using. My sewer bill reflects, mostly the sanitary. The stormwater is extra, the refuse. I mean, I think that it really just supports the transparency that we've been trying to be very clear to the residents of, how we are spending their money.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that, too.
I was going to say that I definitely support us exploring it more. I just want to say, I'm still torn, and I think and part of it is you guys did an amazing job explaining this to us. Thank you. And I thought the report was very detailed. They presented this to us for an hour for us to understand. Obviously, we got a lot more detail. This is going to be, residents are going to be shocked by the increase, and then the difficulty of explaining them to this is just going to be exasperated, and I don't think we should underestimate that. And so it's not that I'm not in favor of this, it's just I'm torn because I hear residents being confused. I'm like, oh, well, we got tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. It's based on impervious surface. Some residents don't even understand what impervious surface is if you haven't done anything in your home for the last 20 years or whatever. I didn't know what impervious surface was before I was a board member. Let me just say that. And so I approach this with caution, I guess is how I would like you all to hear from me.
No, and you're right, because this will show up on a bill and people say, what's this for? Like, well, we've been talking about this sewer project since 2013. Like, I never heard anything about it. I mean, I guarantee you will hear that.
And we know that and people didn't hear about it because we had residents come in front of us a month or two ago, which is fair, regarding that we were doing something at community playfields.
Yeah, and then
so
Thornwood
that's
Park
a
as well.
great example
Same thing.
to us around where residents become engaged, which is fair to them when it affects them. And we all do that regardless of what we are. And so I just want us to understand as we evaluate this, the complexity of communication to our residents and how that will be perceived.
And to your point, $500 extra a year on your bill affects everyone in the village. There isn't anyone who's not going to be affected by that.
But they'll understand a water rate increase.
You got to show how much.
What we should be thinking, I think, about is multiple outreach meetings, not simply in these chambers, but multiple outreach meetings, maybe at the schools, maybe at the community center.
Maybe at the farmer's market?
Maybe at the farmer's market.
Well, you know, we had a really intense communication plan when we approved the project. It included, you know, sort of a folder, mailed folder, and open houses and things like that. So, and we've got the communication consultant now helping us.
Yeah, we'll work on a communications plan. You know, the more type of meetings like that you have, the much more significant the expense is to put those on and bring Raptellis out. I think we can do a lot of communications through our existing resources and several direct mailings leading up to it. And if we begin to prepare residents now, I think we can head off a lot of that. I mean, to Trustee Dodd's point, we've had these discussions internally, the concerns of a new fee that is this high and the reactions from residents. We should go in eyes wide open. People are going to be frustrated. We've even talked to Raptellis about hiring them as our customer service agents for the first 6 to 12 months of this, as they are the experts in explaining stormwater fees and impervious surfaces. Now, obviously, there's a cost to that, but it's something we would consider as we move forward to make sure we're giving residents the best level of customer service we can as we get this off the ground.
Well, we're going into the budget process. I think we have to come up with a way to show, you know, between our tax levy and all these fees and somehow incorporate it in, because again, our tax levy was a very low amount last year and complimentary, but somebody raised it. We raised the water rate. So, you know, all in, what is the cost increasing to the village, and not have it separate, because I think that's where we miss people, because we do a good job showing, you know, that dollar bill that we use, just what the tax levy does. But between the tax levy and all the fees that we pay, they're taxes. I mean, call a spade a spade. So.
And I'm sorry. I just want to say, I don't know that if we need to hire consultants to explain to residents what we're doing with our sewer fee, we should be asking ourselves if residents want to talk to our staff. I'm not trying to, but I just want to say I would be concerned if that's our solution to explaining this is we're going to hire consultants to explain to our residents what we as a board just did.
Well, and I think with the tier structure, it's not as complicated. If you were going to go the Winnetka structure,
Okay.
we would hire them. And that's actually what Winnetka did. They hired their consultant to be their customer service agent because of the complexity of their program.
Which is illustrative of one of the reasons not to do that. Two additional thoughts, I think, to Trustee Barrow's point. Yes, the type of community engagement we need to do is going to be substantial, and both not only how we talked about stormwater project in its inception, but also going back even to when we changed the day and type and method of garbage collection for every house in the village. There was no substitute for direct mail contact, direct to the home multiple times. However many public gatherings are important too, but as many times as we can find ways and different means of getting it into the home, in through the mailbox, into the front door,
special mailing,
hung on the
water
refrigerator
bill.
instead of in an email, that'll help. And also to Trustee Dodd's point, our communication is going to be much easier to understand. The simpler the process is, the fewer tiers, the fewer exceptions, the less complication to it. It'll make it easy for the board members to explain it in common conversation with the residents that you'll have undoubtedly, and for us to put together public information materials that don't look like you're opening up the instructions from an IKEA project.
Here, let me pull out my cheat sheet to answer your question.
Yes, it doesn't have to have a parts list and everything else.
I do think that if you don't do the sewage, I keep mixing my terms, the stormwater fee, and you go back to just increasing the sewage rate, and you're still going to have a substantial increase in your bill, and you're going to get the same number of complaints.
Yes.
It's just, so the only difference between the two of them in some ways is just how much it takes to explain what's going on.
Right.
And I think a lot, frankly, from talking to people in the village, I think a lot of that explanation is going to go back to why are we doing this project in the first place.
Yeah, for sure.
So the tier part's going to be, the easy part is my guess, and the hard part is we're going to have to explain all over again why we're doing something that added $400, however you describe it and however you compute it, to somebody's bill. That's my guess.
I agree. That's a good point, and also something to keep in mind to hopefully allay a little bit of the, I don't know if it'll make it a little bit easier, but it won't immediately go from $0 to $500.
Right.
We'll at least be ramping it up over time, so it will be it'll be a shock to the system, but it gives us some time to work through this, and people hopefully are going to understand it, but yes, we know.
So I found tonight's conversation very helpful. I mean, I put my most effort into stormwater utilities in the years maybe 2010 through 2013, because at that point, as a resident and as someone who was looking to get something done but staring in the face the possibility that we would not do something, the idea of changing behavior at the resident level, trying to address the systemic issue, was foremost in my mind. And so that was sort of the lens in which I was looking at this coming into tonight. I had, and I still have, 6 criteria that I sort of look at in this conversation, and most of this has been touched on already, but the first thing I was looking for, and will continue to look for, is equitability. I mean, that's really been the basis for all of my efforts on this issue over the years anyhow. And so in paying for a project, I feel like that's a principle that has to be maintained. And again, I still haven't totally let go of how, and Trustee Plunkett hit on this very nicely, we still need to try to address the systemic problem that we have a mismatch between development and our infrastructure. And so what I wanted from a utility, and I say past tense because I've learned a lot tonight, and I do appreciate that, is that I really wanted it to encourage the behaviors to change on an individual owner level, and I wanted it to dovetail with our zoning. The application would be really helpful in these cases where we have zoning variances coming before us, and we've spoken to it. I know I have, being able to quantify certain things, whether it be a rain garden, a real rain garden by specification. What is the real difference between a permeable paver and a regular paver? Things like that. The other thing I was looking for tonight that everyone's hit on, so I think we're in lockstep, is the stability of the funding for a project. And then lastly, and again, Trustee Plunkett hit on it, was I wanted it to be transparent, and that's where the, having it customized to the property, I saw that as having some upside, but I've learned a lot about, the downsides of that tonight. So, I just wanted to share these things as where I was coming into tonight, and I've learned a lot about the individual aspect to it and some of the challenges therein, but I haven't totally let go of the possibility that we can encourage greener practices by our residents with this, and so I look forward to the follow-up from staff to look at just give us the info as part of our continued deliberations, Winnetka, Park Ridge, and Downers Grove. So questions tonight from my colleagues were outstanding, and I've learned a lot, and also from the presenters, so thank you. I wish we'd have more public input too, by the way. I would love to hear what people are thinking.
Oh, we will. Well played, Peter.
All right, so Tim and Mike, you guys get the guidance you were looking for?
Yeah, I think what we'll try to do is bring a contract with Raftellus for implementation next steps to the board in July, and at the same time try to answer the questions that the board has asked the staff at that meeting so we can have a further discussion, and we'll keep moving forward, and then we'll figure out the appropriate venues for working through the tax-capped entities, the credit programs, and whatnot as we move forward.
Okay, great. And that, again, that was the purpose of this meeting, was to get this is conceptual still, the devil is in the details, and we'll work through that as we move forward. So thank you, gentlemen, for your presentation. Thank you to people that attended. Thank you to people watching on TV. Next item is other business. I don't believe we have any other business to discuss. And item 5 is adjournment, so I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Is there a second? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Stand adjourned at 9:07.